Welcome to this advanced digital production lecture. In this video, we're going to talk about setting up and creating your story idea. I've noticed that a lot of students, when they get assignments to create an animated short, will kind of hesitate when they are told that they need to come up with some sort of an idea for their story. And I want to talk to you a bit about your story and how you're going to develop it. But before we really jump into the actual lecture part of this discussion, I want to get a few things off my chest. Now, me personally, I'm kind of a writer by nature. I read a lot, I like writing, I'm a big fan of creative writing, but I'm not really a big fan of applying a rigid structure to my writing process. To me, it's a bit more organic. Some things will just come to me, I'll read over them, I'll read them to friends, there'll be some revision and so on and so forth, but some of you might not have that luxury, or that method just might not speak to you. So to try to cater to everybody, I'm going to walk you through a production process that kind of shows how you can come up with an idea. And we're going to be showing how we, in a sense, came up with the idea that we're actually using throughout the production you'll see put together in these videos. So when coming up with your story, you need to think about what type of feelings you want your story to convey. Now, you might jump into your story thinking, oh, well, I know going in that I want my story to involve some sort of epic space battle, or I need it to be about a robot who gets a beach ball for Christmas. I don't know. You might already have some sort of general idea, but you need to stop and think about what you want your audience to feel. Do you want your audience to actually care about these creatures that are in your story? How do you want them to feel about them? Now, in my personal experience, I find that as far as what you're trying to make the audience feel, humor is going to be far and wide the easiest thing to make anybody feel. And that's something that I think I may have mentioned in an earlier video, but I just really want to drive it home. Everybody wants to laugh. Even if they're in a bad mood and they don't laugh at your jokes, deep down, somewhere within, they want to laugh. Everybody wants to laugh. They may not want to watch some sort of epic space battle. I mean, there are times I'm like a big Battlestar Galactica fan, but I don't watch Battlestar Galactica every single night when I go home because I don't always want to see that. So just realize that in some cases, if you go with a very specific idea, such as, I want a ghost that turns into a vampire and attacks some dude and then gets shot by another vampire with a revolver, that you're going to be narrowing down who you're speaking to with everything you do, which is not necessarily a problem. You should just be aware of it. Not everybody thinks that the same things are cool that you do, and certainly they don't always think that the same thing is funny either, but you'll find in general that people are, for the most part, I think, they're more willing to listen when it comes to something that is funny. Now, when approaching the humorous side of things, which is really what I'm focusing on, there's some things to keep in mind. So let me start jotting some notes down. So humor. There's a lot of different forms of humor, and this is not a class over humor. This is just something to kind of get the gears turning. I mean, how can you make people laugh? What kinds of humor do you have? Well, I mean, you got the classic joke. And I mean, if you're really having a hard time coming up with an idea for a story, go pick a favorite joke that you've heard, preferably if you're actually doing something to show to a bunch of people it's a relatively clean joke. But try to produce that joke in a 3D animation format. A horse walks into a bar, and, the bartender says, "Why the long face?" Well, I mean, you could have this big, long, dramatic setup of a horse walking down a street in some old Western town or whatever, and he ends up strolling into a bar, and the bartender just looks over him and says, "Hey, why the long face?" Yeah, not everybody would really laugh, but they'd probably smirk a little bit because everybody's heard that joke. So you've got to, that kind of approach. You've got things like slapstick. And slapstick's great. It's something, the Three Stooges really, I think, did a lot of the pioneering of this. And really, it was just proving that human beings, for whatever reason, take some sort of fundamental glee in watching other human beings get the crud kicked out of them. So, you can always do that. Somebody stubs their toe, and for some reason it's funny. There's things like that you can apply to your animations. And you've also got things like, and one of my favorites, and I love trying to come up with ways to employ this in my stories, is pulling the rug, and that's just what I call it. I'm sure somebody else has said that before. I don't think it's my idea. I don't think I ever have a truly original thought. But this is pulling the rug, and that's where you build up the audience down this one path with this one general idea, only to, at the very last second, turn the tables on them in some sort of an interesting and funny way. Now, in general, and these are just 3 different approaches to humor. I mean, there's all sorts of different things you could do that would be funny. Go watch some episodes of your favorite sitcom, or things that you have seen that are funny. Go watch The Simpsons and find something that makes you laugh, and start trying to figure out, why was that funny? Was it because I knew the characters, and I feel like I've come to really know them almost like real people, and so they did something that was totally in their character? If not, what was it that was so funny, and how can I borrow from that, that sort of thing? Because we've been borrowing from other sources for years. You can't really say that all that much these days is really original at all. But I did want to advise you in this direction, and it's not a mandate. I'm not saying don't do this. This is just advice from somebody who's seen a lot of students do a lot of animated shorts, and that's, in general, if you're trying to appeal to a large audience, consider avoiding... That doesn't look like a very nice V, so there we go. Avoiding the idea of cool. If you're doing an animation just because you think it's cool, I would advise you to maybe reconsider. Maybe. Now, you might be so convinced that it's cool, or you just really, really want to do it, and in your heart of hearts, it's just what you were meant to do. And if that's the case, please feel free. But understand going in that what you think is cool and what everybody else thinks is cool, or a lot of the people you'll be showing this animation to, might not necessarily coincide. And that can be a little bit of a letdown, because understand that if you're showing your animated short to non-3D animator audiences, people that aren't involved in 3D, and they don't get it, they will just decide not to like your animated short out of hand. And because of that, your story and the way you approach your storytelling process are really probably the most important part of the entire production. Just ask Pixar. Now, practically never is going to work on every single person if you just try to go with the cool bit, because at some point it's probably going to be cliche. I mean, some of the things I mentioned earlier, like vampires and spaceships and that sort of thing, those have been done to death. And if you really start showing animations like that, somebody's going to probably roll their eyes. Now, if you don't care about that, if you're just creating a short strictly for you and you're not worried about an audience and you just want to get it out of your system, hey, go for it. Have a great time with it. These are just random bits of advice that I would throw your way, again, just from having seen so many students try to approach problems like this. Now, since we're going for funny in the animated short that we've come up with for this class, we need to start thinking about how this is going to work. Now, the original idea, and by now I'm sure you guys have all read the story that is a part of this class, where we have a knight and a little goblin, and they're going to have a nice little encounter. But the original idea was that I wanted to do some sort of animated short that talked to and or made fun of the MMORPG gamer. I've always been really kind of in awe at how big the MMORPG world actually became. It was just truly incredible that so many people wanted to just sit on their computers and really just enter this completely alternate world that doesn't really do anything beneficial for you except offer a little bit of entertainment, and that's fine. I watch TV, I play my Xbox 360 like a good little whatever, but I see people who just invest so much time in it. Like they'll get up and they'll play for 15 hours and go to bed, and then get up and repeat the process the very next day, and that completely blows my mind. Not to mention, right before I came up with the idea for this, I'd seen a couple of things that really kind of, tickled me a little bit. There's the Leroy Jenkins animation that you can find on the internet, and of course there's the World of Warcraft episode of South Park, which really just takes the idea and really mocks it in a whole bunch of ways. But I wanted to kind of go in a similar direction, but I had some changes I wanted to make. A lot of these animations that you've already seen having to do with MMORPG players, a lot of them cover Warcraft. Of course, it is like the biggest MMORPG out there, so it's the squeakiest wheel. Let's make sure that it gets the most attention, of course. But a lot of them use machinima. They'll actually take the game engine itself and they'll make the characters talk as if you're actually looking in the game. And I always thought that was kind of cool, but there was an underlying theme that I didn't think anybody had really explored too much, except for maybe the South Park episode, and that's where you break the barrier. And then I'm just going to start jotting some notes down. And so we break the barrier between the player and the character. So give me a second to jot that down. Between player, character. I mean, even in most animations, it's somebody who's playing the game. You can tell you've got an actual player that is controlling what you're looking at. But I thought it'd be cool if you just took the entire universe and assumed that what was going on in the game was real. What if that was actually taking place? And there wasn't some all-knowing character, which is funny because the player, I don't mean to say character, the player actually becomes like a form of deity to their character because you influence all their actions. But what if you remove that? And the character itself inside the game had his own motivation, and he was doing the same things that a player does when they're controlling the character, but he was doing it himself. I actually kind of got inspiration from that from watching the movie Tron, where you had these programs who were like self-contained people. They had their own motivations, they had their own reasons for doing things, and it was all because some user had programmed them to think or behave that way. And I thought that was really cool. What if you could take your MMORPG world and just step into it like that, so that the characters become real people and are no longer just an avatar being controlled by someone else? But in order to really take this idea and push it, we had to think of some sort of a story. Now what I'm about to do here is an idea web to show several different stories that could come out of this general idea. Now, one of these is going to be our story. Now, I just want to go on record this, for the sake of honesty. I did not use an idea web to come up with a story, but there are some of you I know who probably appreciate the idea of some sort of rigid structure, even with the creative process. And other people, maybe you're just stuck in a rut, and you just can't think of what it is you want your animated short to be about. And an idea web, what I'm about to jot down here, can be a really nice way to help you come up with your story. So let's start off. In the center of my idea web, I want to put my audience, which in general is going to be the MMORPG player. Now, because the MMORPG world has become so big, I'm not just talking to the player, I'm talking to everybody who knows anything about these kinds of games. And I mean, that's becoming so prolific. I think just the other day, I saw a Toyota commercial for a Toyota pickup truck that took place inside World of Warcraft. So I mean, it's getting out there, it's huge. So let's start off with that being the center of our web. Now, what do we know about MMORPG players? Well, some of the things we can infer, maybe stereotypes. Don't be afraid. Just jot down whatever comes out. We know that they have a tendency to be kind of elitist. If you're completely new to the game, they'll call you a noob, or they just don't have time to deal with you. Maybe you just got in and you're new to the game, you haven't really played much, and you're a little bit intimidated, and so you ask if you could join up with this party of people, and they're like, well, you're a noob. They've got this kind of elitist, kind of snobbish air about them. It boils down to just taking themselves far too seriously. So that's kind of a funny thing. Now, what comes out from that? If we push that to the next level, if you expand upon that, you get that they have no respect for noobs. And we'll put noobs in quotes. You noob. So that's something that kind of comes out of this. And we could probably use that to come up with a story. And here in just a few minutes, I'm going to go over some sort of story that covers all of the main branches that we create from this web, just so you can see how you could go about creating some sort of a story by expanding on these ideas. Now, what's something else that we can assume or that we know or that is stereotyped about MMORPG players? Well, earlier I mentioned that there's this kind of thing where a lot of these game players will just sit at their computers for days on end. We get stories on the news about, players who've died because they did not get out of their chair. Apparently, their need to play the game actually overrode their survival instinct, and they ended up dying. So, in order to stay in any seat and stay awake and playing that long, we can probably assume that most of these players have some sort of a caffeine addiction. And that could be something we could maybe turn into a cool idea. And if we had to expand on that at least one level, we could maybe, how are they getting their caffeine? And everybody knows the answer to that because I can imagine you're all generally computer people. And the answer would be energy drinks, even if it just means coffee. And we could probably turn something funny into that. Now, what's another idea? Let's say, here's something that I always thought was kind of funny. And that is that a lot of people, and this started even before World of Warcraft, even when the big one out there was EverQuest. Everybody had to get these expansion packs, and I don't think there's an MMORPG, any successful one anyway, that is immune to this. Everybody has to get this expansion pack because it adds on a new world, it adds new enemies, it adds new weapons. And in a lot of cases, the people who are buying these haven't even seen all of the worlds that are included in the original game. They certainly haven't gathered all the weapons. They don't know all there is to do. But that expansion pack is out there. Because the advertising is so good, all they know is that they are probably less of a player and a little bit, less of a person on some level because they don't have this expansion. So they rush right out. They buy this $30 expansion to a $50 game that they're paying $15 a month to just to play. And so you end up with a bunch of players that are spending a lot of money. I mean, let's face it. If you want to take MMORPG gaming seriously, you're spending some dough. There is a reason that MMORPG logins, if you sell them, can actually sell for a lot of money. You get stories about them selling for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, just because somebody has put so much work into it. And I know a lot of the MMORPG companies don't allow you to do that. It's in the EULA that you shouldn't be doing it. But it kind of makes sense if you wanted to move your login. You've invested a lot of time and money into making that login as good as it is. So, you wouldn't just hand it away. You'd want something as compensation. So what are they spending their money on? Well, as we've already explained, that's going to be mostly on these expansion packs. And, you could go on from there. There's some of these MMORPGs where you can actually pay money so that you end up with more money in the game. And that blows my mind. I'm not even going to go off on a rant about that. But so what's another direction we could go? Well, because these people are, in general, because we're kind of going with the stereotypical approach to an MMORPG player, they're probably going to be shut-ins. They're the kind of people that don't really get out much. They, sit down in, we'll just say their parents' basement all the time, playing World of Warcraft or EverQuest 2 or whatever, the big game of the moment is, and that's really all they do. So that could be an angle we could take and maybe elaborate on. Now, what comes out of being a shut-in? Well, they do have a lot of free time. Apparently, because, if they play this MMORPG all the time, they clearly don't have a job, which is one of the biggest reasons that I never really got into this world at all. And as kind of a byproduct of this, now I'm expanding on this particular thread, not for any particular reason other than this one just kind of appeals to me the most. And you'll find that when you do word webs like this, that you'll find a thread that you're like, ooh, that I kind of like that. Because, if you think back, I don't know if any of you may have actually seen the World of Warcraft episode of South Park, but there was that character who was the antagonist of the whole show. He had the super powered character that just stormed through World of Warcraft, killing everybody. And they show the guy who's actually controlling it, the player who's controlling that character. And he's this old, middle-aged, fat guy who's sitting down in a basement somewhere with a little carpal tunnel brace on his hands, never talks, never moves. The only thing that ever moves, really, is his index finger on the mouse. So, I thought that was great. That was probably my favorite part of that whole show, was just seeing that guy who's a complete and utter shut-in. And some of the things about that lots of free time while they're playing the game, and this one really does crack me up, is that they will spend time on mundane tasks within the game. And this really is kind of one of the funniest things, in my opinion, about the MMORPG world, and that is that players will spend a ton of time doing these stupid little tasks in the game just to make their character more powerful. And that's a riot to me. It's like, take package A to site B, or, go kill 5 of these creatures, or go bring me this item, or, whatever. But they're these stupid little things where if you had a game, if there was some sort of a video game where your only task was to just do that, and there wasn't a leveling system or anything like that, it was just mission after mission of these stupid little mundane tasks, you wouldn't keep playing that game. You'd eventually go like, oh, I'm tired of this, and you pull it out. But because you have this inherent desire for your character in the game to become powerful, and because you need the experience points from these tasks to level up, you'll go through them. In effect, you just took on a job in the game. Just like, if you were going to McDonald's, except in a really funny and sick twist, you're not getting paid to do this job. You're actually paying, on average, about $15 a month to be able to do these mundane tasks over and over. So that's funny that people actually put themselves through that. And from that, really just one more little expansion, just because we're really kind of on a roll here, we have the whole concept of leveling up, where it's no longer, the fact that the game is enlightening, that it's enjoyable, that the plot's going anywhere. You'll find most of these MMORPGs don't really have too much of a plot anyways. But there's nothing going on here aside from the fact that you want your character to get more and more powerful. In a lot of cases, you might not even have a reason to do that. You just want him to get more powerful so that he can take up bigger jobs and get even more powerful. But there's never a real reason for him to get more powerful. You just feel like you need to do it. And obviously, if you guys have been following along and you know the story that we've come up with, this is the branch that I ended up following and really using to create my story. But rather than show you like this kind of prefabricated method for coming up with a story that we all already know, let's talk about some of the other directions we could have possibly gone just from this word web. So what I'm going to do is number each of these branches. Let's say this is, actually, no, let's go the other direction. So I get out my mighty eraser, take that out. Let's go clockwise. We'll say this is idea number 1, and this is idea number 2, and here's idea number 3, and our final one will be idea number 4. And we all already know that idea 4 is the one that I'm going to be going with, but let's talk about what could have been and some of the other ideas that could have come out of this. So what could we do in terms of a story that is about the elitist nature of MMORPG players? And I sat down and thought about this. I mean, what's funny about that? How can you make that into a story? And I thought to myself, I still like the idea of 2 characters interacting in some way. So let's say, just as an example, we have a short about 2 characters, and they meet, and one is going to be really experienced, the other is going to be your noob. So, that way we're really bringing out this whole no respect for noobs thing. You got to have somebody who's, venerated and he's been playing forever and ever and ever, and this one guy who maybe picked up the game the other day. But again, the way I want to approach this story, this whole idea of the short, is not that there's a player involved, not even that these are 2 players talking to each other vicariously through the game, but that the game world is real, and that these characters are real people with their own motivations, who just seem to be acting the same way they would if they were being controlled by a game player. So let's say we have this experienced character and this noobish character who they meet. The short could focus on the ridiculous things that this elite, venerated, experienced player would say, and the odd things that they hold in high regard. Like the rookie would show a vast amount of common sense. He's new to this whole thing, and he's not completely swept up in the idea of, well, I'm going to sit here and just keep hacking these tribbles to pieces because I get 3 experience points each time I do that. He kind of has a more worldly view, a more realistic view, and brings in some outside world experience. And of course, the experienced player is going to kind of shun that a little bit because he's completely wrapped up in the game world. The only thing that's important to him is what's going on in the game. So eventually, the noobish character could talk the experienced character into showing off in some way and thereby getting himself killed. And that could be like, you're so experienced, maybe you could take on that dragon, or, maybe you could, cast a spell on this, whatever. You can come up with all sorts of different ways, but I'm just kind of, generally telling where the story could go. So, the experienced character, through a lot of discussion, trying to show how much greater he is than this noob, and how the noob is really kind of worthless, could go through some display of his power and end up getting himself killed in the process. And the rookie can then claim whatever items were left behind. And that could be the end of your short. So there's one idea there that you could probably take and break down and start expanding upon and figuring out what is the exact situation under which these two characters meet, what do they end up talking about, where do things go from there. Let's move on to the second branch, which is this whole idea of our gamers being addicted to caffeine because they've got to be up and running all the time. So let's say these are just ideas that I came up with just to coincide with this word web. So in this case, I actually did the word web first and then made up some stories that went along with it. But let's say we have this impressive-looking knight character who's strung out on caffeine, so he can just barely talk. I mean, he's jittery and gibberish, and he just talks really fast, and maybe he's twitching a little bit. And perhaps he's going to get into a discussion with a more, we'll use the term in quotes, and I'll do the little quote fingers, you just can't see him on the video, or a normal character about how pointless it is to get that bent out of shape when you could just rest and be more effective. So, why is it somebody would play the game for 18 hours straight, or 26 hours, or 35 hours, whatever, without any kind of break, keeping themselves awake by drinking balls or Red Bulls or whatever, when they could just go take a nap and awake feeling refreshed and then get back into the game with a level head? Why do they keep themselves so strung out? And the two characters could discuss that sort of thing, and that could be really funny. Some of the more humorous aspects could be how the caffeine knight, that's what we'll call him anyways, can't stop shaking, spontaneously shouts, or maybe his armor is going to be rattling throughout like most of the animation. And you could I think you could take that and expand on it, come up with a direct ending maybe, and have something funny out of that. Another option too is that instead of a knight, it could be a wizard, and his spells keep getting botched because his hand is shaking, or maybe he keeps randomly firing spells out of his wand or whatever because he's so high strung. And that right there is in and of itself a funny scene. So just by coming up with that and sitting down and exploring that, you could probably come up with a really good story. Now this brings us to our third idea, which is this whole the spending of money to buy all these expansion packs. So we have our, let's say we have a warrior. Again, it could be a knight, could be a wizard, could be whatever. It doesn't really matter what it is, but he's stalking his prey in search of some mystical talisman. He's got to be searching for something. And as he travels, he keeps running into these mysterious force field-like barriers. And if you kind of follow the MMORPG world at all, you could probably already get an idea of why these barriers would be there. But when he gets to them, he's going to receive a message that says if he wants to explore the region beyond, he's got to purchase some expansion. We'll just call it Expansion X for some amount of gold. Again, we're trying to pull everybody out of the gaming world. There's no player here, just a character who's experiencing the gaming world as if it were the real universe. So we're running around, we're trying to complete whatever mission. Doesn't even have to be searching for something. Maybe he's just trying to get to, from point A to point B, but keeps running into these mysterious signs where he can't go any further. And it says, if you want to proceed, you've got to pay and buy this expansion so that you have access to this extra world. And then each time he does this, you could have the environment change. So, it's like, some of these expansions are themed. In fact, they almost always are themed in some way. So maybe he buys expansion X, and now the realm he goes into is all snowy, and then he tries to, go through that and has to buy another expansion, after which he's in some sort of a swamp or a marsh. You could really have a lot of fun with just this process, and the whole thing is just kind of a humorous commentary on the purchasing of these expansion packs, just to get a little further to do some silly mundane task. But finally, after spending all of his gold, the character could find his talisman or whatever it is he was looking for. But along with that, he gets some sort of a message about how he now qualifies to purchase the new expansion Y, which is available for a limited time for only $29.95 gold. And in disgust, he's just going to throw down the object and stalk away, and that would be the end of your animation. So you could have a lot of fun with that. You could have all sorts of different environments the character's walking through. You could have his expression changing as he gets more and more upset about having to spend money just to get from one place to another. It seems like you could really take that and get something really, really humorous out of it. But that brings us to our fourth idea. Now, this is the idea that we ended up going with for this actual production. But from here, we get to kind of talk about how the story developed, because it wasn't that I just had this idea from the get-go, that it was perfect from the start. In fact, that's far from the case. So let's just follow the web and just start off with what we initially came up with, which is that we have a warrior character who is just arbitrarily killing everything in his path trying to gain experience. A comic point, and I think this would be really great, is if the character actually watches the experience point values float up into the air as he kills somebody. Now, that again, it kind of it crosses that line between is this a video game and is this reality. It kind of blurs that line just a little bit, but I'm okay with that. The big thing is that I don't want there to feel like there is a player who's actually controlling this. The character needs to be real. If the environment still feels like a video game, I'm totally cool with that. And I think it would really help the audience kind of see what's going on and in a broader way understand why the warrior is doing what he does if you see some sort of an EXP number float up out of the dead carcass or as it fades away to nothing. Anyways, so these numbers are going to keep floating up off everything he kills, but it's just not enough. And finally, we're going to see this little ugly goblin who, I like the idea of him being, that kind of so ugly he's cute kind of thing, like a bulldog, because everybody thinks, or like, was it a pug, a little pug puppy, which nobody can argue that those dogs are ugly, little flat face and wrinkles, and they are ugly, but they are so ugly that they're absolutely adorable. And I'd like to get something similar for this goblin. But anyways, so our character decides to take him out because obviously this goblin, would be worth a whole lot more experience points than what our warrior has got up to this point. Now at the very last second, the goblin's going to cry out for his life, and he's going to engage the character in some sort of conversation. Tell him to stop, get the warrior's attention before he gets hacked in two. And then I want them to talk about the ethical implications of outright slaughter just to become stronger with no real point. And eventually the goblin is going to talk the character into doing something amazingly stupid and get himself killed as an alternative to actually killing the goblin. Now, when I first started putting this story together, that's all I had, was just this rough idea that I have character A, who's a warrior, character B, who is this goblin. The warrior is going to be hacking down everything he can, trying to gain experience, and he wants to go kill the goblin to also get more experience. But the goblin's going to stop him short and start questioning him and saying, why are you doing this? What's going on? Why would you want to just kill absolutely everything you come across? Because you could really turn that into a funny thing. Now, I got inspiration from this. I don't want you guys to think that I got inspiration for this, I guess I should say. I don't want you to think that I came up with this, entirely on my own. I'm not taking credit for this as a 100% original idea. Obviously, the whole idea probably spawned from me seeing things like the South Park episode from World of Warcraft or vice versa. But there were other things too. The whole discussion that I imagined in between the warrior and the goblin, before I even knew what they were going to say, I had kind of drawn inspiration from the scene in Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail when King Arthur is riding through the mud pasture, and you get the two peasants who start questioning him about England being a dictatorship and so on and so forth. And now we see the violence inherent in the system and all that great stuff. What if you had an encounter that was kind of like that, where somebody with a whole lot of common sense, but not really a direct look at how things should or shouldn't be done, gets a hold of somebody who's already caught up in their own little world and just kind of talks him not so much out of what he was going to do as much as into something else that ends up getting him killed. Now, that ended up progressing. We took that story and I talked about it with friends, including Buzz. I talked with my brother. I talked with my sister-in-law. Anybody I could get to listen to the story and give me feedback. And from their feedback and from their ideas, I was able to come up with other things that kind of helped accentuate the story, like what is it that the character actually, and the warrior, ends up getting talked into doing, and so on and so forth. But let's just say you stop there. You have this general idea of character A and character B meeting. Character A is going to kill character B, but character B instead talks character A into killing himself through some other means. So from here, you could move on to other aspects of the story and come back to your detailing a little bit later. This allows you to keep things fresh without forcing yourself to lock down and get any one thing fleshed out. So let's, aside from discussing with your friends and family, that's a key thing. Make sure that you do that. But you need to develop this idea a piece at a time. Now, what kind of characters? I mean, we know that just from the general idea that I like the idea of a warrior and a goblin, but there's no reason why it has to be a warrior. We want it to be in this kind of fantasy MMORPG world, so it could be a wizard. It could be an elf with a bow, because that's kind of stereotypical. If you're an elf, you have to have a bow. I mean, of course, Lord of the Rings kind of fixed that problem for us, but not really. Legolas was just, awesome with his bow. So there's all sorts of different directions you could go with your character. Are they male? Are they female? What is their class or profession? What is their overall attitude? What is their stature? Are they, tall and muscular? Are they short and stout? All sorts of different things that you need to kind of start thinking about. Because in the end, you're showing this story. You're not telling this story, you're showing it. And the way that it looks is going to affect how the audience behaves. I mean, if you have this really, paunchy, fat, blubbery warrior running around with a sword, the audience may start to question if he's running around killing everything and doesn't seem to be getting exhausted. Because stereotypically speaking, if we see somebody that is short and fat and overweight, we think that they're going to get exhausted at any amount of exertion. So keep that kind of thing in mind. Obviously, in this case, if we have a warrior who's just hacking everything to bits and is just really adept at swinging his sword around, you get that mental image of your tall, broad-shouldered, probably not quite so bright warrior, like Conan the Barbarian, who's better with his sword than he is with his good sense. Things like that will start to come to mind as you think about your story. Now, what about this other character? Well, we know he's a goblin. We know we want him to be generally cute, but in that ugly sort of way, you got to ask the same questions. Are they male? Are they female? What do they do? What are they doing here? Why are they walking around? Even if you're not planning on exploring a certain aspect of a character in your story, it can be very useful if you jot down everything you can think of for a character. I mean, their background, their history, where they came from, why they look like they do. Anything you can jot down may help you come up with certain decisions that you'll need, because it's not always, certainly it's not always, it's always going to be more than just how they look. It's going to be how they present themselves on the screen. Your warrior, for example, how is he going to talk? How is he going to communicate? Is he expressive? Does he talk with his hands? How does he portray himself? Is he well-spoken? Well, stereotypically you'd think not. He's kind of a goal-minded, fairly simple guy who is much more comfortable swinging his sword than he is talking his way out of any situation. So you wouldn't expect him to be very well-spoken. You would think, or at least I thought when I was putting him together, that he'd be the kind of character that would get easily confused if he was ever posed with some sort of intellectual problem, because that's not his forte. And that's exactly what the goblin is going to use against him to push him to his demise. So you got to think about things like that. You need to jot all of these things down and really start to develop these characters. The key there is to learn as much as you can about your characters. In fact, that is so important. We're going to wipe out our word web, which hopefully if you're following along, you've already written down. And the key is to learn as much as possible about your characters. That is so important. So vital. You need to know who they are. You need to know what their motivations are. What are they doing? What kind of attitudes they have? How well spoken are they? How do they communicate? Do they wave their hands? How do they animate? How are they going to move? Does a character walk with a limp? Do they twitch when they talk? All of these things are going to be so important when you get to actually creating and then animating and then presenting your character to your audience, because every subtle thing is going to tell your audience something else about that character. And this is something that I see a lot of people, I don't want to say ignore so much as just forget about. As if you're completely new to this story creation process, that you will forget how important it is to add these little subtleties. And every single successful animation you've ever seen has been all about the subtleties. God is in the details, and I don't use that as a religious point at all. It's just it's a quote that is very apt. The highest power, the source of everything you want to achieve is hidden inside the details that you add in. I think one of the favorite things that comes readily to mind is in the animated film Princess Mononoke, which is one of my not Princess Mononoke, I'm sorry. It's the other one, Spirited Away, which is actually my very favorite animated film of all time. I love Spirited Away. But there's this one scene where Sen, our little character, she is about to run outside and she doesn't have her shoes on, and she grabs one of her shoes and slips it on, and she taps her toe on the ground to, kick her shoe into place, kind of, settle her foot into it. And it's such a natural feeling, such a little... you wouldn't even think to do it if you were just saying as an animator, well, she needs to go put her shoes on and she needs to get across the room. You'd have to sit down and think, how would a little girl put her shoes on before she goes out the door? You'd want to do homework. You'd want to, put a pair of shoes out and maybe find some little girl, watch her do it, and record that sort of thing. You need to do your homework and learn as much as you can about your characters and what they do and how they do it. So I hope I've driven that home enough for you to really get the point. Now, on that, try this. This is an interesting exercise that can really help you out, and it's probably harder than you think, is come up with 20 questions about your character. So write down 20 questions, hopefully about different things. Try to keep them as varied as you can about your character, just to learn more about them, and then answer each one of those questions. And, I did this about the warrior and the goblin character, and I'm not going to share all of my questions with you because I want you to actually have to go through and think of them yourself. But I had, start off with some simple things like, what's the character's gender? What's their stature? These are things we've already discussed. But, what's their purpose? What are they actually trying to accomplish? Is there anything about them that's out of the ordinary, such as a distinguishing mark? Or do they have one arm that's bigger than the other? Does, their head lean over to one side? All sorts of things you could add in. But try to come up with 20 separate questions that have to do with your character, and then answer each one of those. And if you can think of more than 20, do as many as you can. But try to force yourself to 20. Okay, so with that, let's see, that's a quick look about how to learn more about your character. And, some of the things that we learned about, like, the knight character, for example, I knew I wanted him to be human. I wanted the audience to kind of be able to immediately relate to him on some level. So I didn't want some sort of big monstrous-looking orc or an elf or anything like that. I wanted a human being. I want him to be, well-built. He's got the broad-shouldered and slim-waist look of a warrior. He's going to need to be confident but not too bright. As far as his age, that kind of indiscriminate age that probably sits between the late 20s and the late 30s, where you can't really tell how old somebody is. It's, just a guy, for example. The sword is going to be key, because he's an armed, trained weapon of destruction. He's here to hack things to little bits, leaving nothing but dead bodies in his wake, and therefore he's got to have a weapon. And in this case, I like the idea of him swinging a sword, but, you need to ask that question anyway, because after considering, you might want him to have a battle axe, you might want him to have a war hammer, all sorts of things he could be swinging around. But I like the idea of the classic sword. And in this case, I don't even want it to be a very ornate sword. I'm thinking it needs to be something fairly simple so it doesn't draw too much attention. The sword is in itself secondary to the warrior who's swinging it around, at least in this particular case. Now, if you were doing an animation about the sword, or where the sword was this big heirloom that our warrior was so proud of, then you might want to make the sword a little more ornate. But you'll notice that spawned another question as well. Tell me about this sword. You just take each and every little idea that you have, and you elaborate on it, and you write down notes, and you use these as production notes to come up with every other part of your story. The big thing about the warrior that I had in mind, and again, this comes to this pulling in of inspiration, where you don't have to invent everything yourself. You're not reinventing the wheel. I wanted this warrior to remind our more educated audiences of the Tick. Big chested, big chin, loud and kind of heroic in that sort of boisterous way, but certainly not the brightest crayon in the box of Crayolas. Kind of a dim-witted, all-or-nothing sort of hero. That's what I was really shooting for, and that's the kind of thing I wanted to see. I also like the idea of him being a bit on the egotistical side. Make him pose a lot, puff out his chest, plant his fists on his hips, swing his sword in really impressive ways, even when he's talking. Things like that to really drive home the how this character behaves, because a lot of that is where you're going to find your comedy. If you can take those features and push them over the top, you're going to end up with something that Jim Carrey learned a long time ago, and that is the over the top approach to humor can really get people at the very least smiling at what you're doing if they're not laughing out loud. Now, the Goblin, what did we come up with? Well, we talk about his, what does he look like? Well, we know he's going to be ugly, but let's generalize a little more. Short. In order for him to really be the antithesis of our hero, he needs to not be handsome. He needs to be tiny, kind of frail, probably like a pot belly, because that really just that hits home. He's just this harmless little thing that doesn't really mean you any harm. Well, what's he going to act like? Well, we know that our knight is going to be this big, loud, boisterous, the Tick kind of creature. So how do you offset that? Well, I like the idea of the goblin appearing to be kind of a frightened, submissive, but eager to help the knight find some alternative kind of character. Now, that wasn't how he started out. When I first started jotting down ideas, I went a little bit too far too quickly, and I started jotting down ideas for a script. And I found out later that some of the ideas that I'd come up with for the things the goblin was saying were just a little too far into the realm of being kind of a jerk. It's like he knew a little bit too much of what was going on, and it's like he was trying to actually bait the warrior into doing something stupid, and it was so blatantly obvious that it kind of stole the punchline. So after presenting that to Buzz, he said he didn't really like the way that the goblin was behaving, and from that we both sat down and discussed, what are all alternatives, and he needed to be a little more on the submissive and frightened side, because that's where we get to this pulling the rug out from under the audience kind of thing, where we have this little goblin who seems to be really scared. He's about to get hacked into two, and he's just trying to help the warrior come up with some other thing he could kill so that he doesn't end up getting killed. And then we find out at the very end that the goblin wasn't scared. Oh, he was probably scared, but it wasn't that he was just trying to get rid of the warrior so he'd kill something else. He's trying to outsmart the warrior, and that's where everybody's going to get their big humorous moment. But, aside from that, what else do we know about him? Well, how is he dressed? What's he wearing? We know our knight is probably going to be wearing some sort of armor, maybe a tunic, or he could take the barbarian approach as just a warrior, where he's wearing a loincloth and maybe a leather strap around his head, like Conan the Barbarian, so you can see his chest and maybe a cool scar, a tattoo or something. All sorts of directions you can go. Now, the big reason I went with armor on the knight is that I had envisioned the goblin as actually being wearing little socky sort of shoes, like the kind of things you see in Disney cartoons, and he's just wearing like maybe a little furry loincloth and maybe a helmet. As pointless as that would be, but think of some little helmet, maybe something like an old German army helmet, or a medieval derivative of that with a spike on top. Just something that's kind of cute and a little over the top. I drew a lot of inspiration for the goblin character from looking at the works of Brian Froud, who has done so many goblins. He's the guy who is the artistic genius behind such films as The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, so he knows his goblins. And so when I knew I wanted to make a goblin, that's the first person I reached for. Now, that's just a sampling of some of the things that I sat down and thought about and, tried to come up with about my characters. And I encourage you to do the same thing about your characters. Think about who they are. Think about what they look like and how they act and why they're acting the way they are and what is it that they have on them that makes them a specific character that's doing what they're doing. There's really no such thing as too many questions. Really sit down with yourself and think about every little thing you can to drive home who your characters are. Again, learn as much as possible about your characters. Once you are done with that, you can get back to your story. And that's the beautiful thing, and that's why I kind of like getting the general idea for your story, then figuring out your characters, and then finalizing your story. And the reason for that is that now that you know who these characters are, you can finish up the story with a much clearer idea of what those characters would do in your given situation. It's like you set up the playing field, you grab your pieces, and you've got the pieces all nicely detailed, and now you can put those pieces into your playing field and have a much clearer idea of how they should be behaving as you finish off everything that's going on in the story. And again, it just boils down to asking questions. So here's just some example questions that I came up with. So these really are questions I asked myself to really develop the story. What is the knight attacking before meeting the goblin? And to keep things nicely offset and to really drive home the fact that what this warrior, what this knight is doing is fairly pointless, or at least it should appear so to the audience, you want these to be cute and cuddly things that he's killing. Things that would not otherwise harm you. Maybe a big butterfly, I don't know, maybe a bunny or something, just stuff that really shouldn't be harming you. But at the same time, you got to be a little careful because you don't want it to be so cute that the audience is horrified by what they see. You don't want something that's adorable like a little Care Bear to come out and then the warrior hacks him in two. Now, while granted, many of you probably would think that's really funny, you would still, freak out certain members of your audience. So you want to keep the visceral nature of the violence, at least I do anyways, to a minimum so that you can have a broader spectrum of humor actually taking place. So what I had thought of was maybe like a big butterfly that was kind of flapping his wings and, maybe perched on a piece of grass. And you get that kind of effect like it's almost like an homage to Bambi meets Godzilla. If you guys have ever seen that really old animation, you can find it on the internet in several different places. But you start off with this very large butterfly, and we kind of pan out from it, and he's just sitting there doing what butterflies do, gently flapping his wings, maybe rubbing his head with his arm. I don't know, all sorts of things you can make him do. But then all of a sudden, the sword just swings down, ching, and just takes the butterfly completely out of the frame. Don't show the violence. Just make the movement so quick that the violence is more implied than demonstrated, because in one swift motion, you'd suddenly just see a sword that is chopped down where the butterfly used to be. And of the butterfly, there is now no sign. And the cool thing about doing that is you get to avoid, somebody in the audience being horrified because you just hacked this cute little butterfly into two pieces. So, once the objects disappear, then you can go back to your experience points thing. But the key here is thinking about what it is he's going to be attacking. Now, for simplicity's sake, and I mean simplicity in a lot of different directions, simplicity in terms of what you're having to produce to tell the story, what you're having to write about, and so on and so forth, the amount of modeling and texturing you have to do, the amount of animation, rigging, the whole nine. I like the idea of not getting too bogged down with a bunch of different creatures to destroy. Not to mention that you don't want to distract the audience, or at least I didn't want to distract the audience, by allowing them to get too caught up in how cute the objects or critters were that our knight was destroying. So, maybe show the butterfly, and the butterfly gets hacked down, and then one or two other things that the warrior kills, maybe those are off camera somehow. And you could maybe hide them in grass, or maybe our warrior has just run up to the top of a small knoll, and so the next thing he hacks is just behind the knoll, and we don't really see it, but he can bring his sword down like he's killing something, and then you could have maybe a furry arm shoot up where the sword came down, just something like that, to show that there is some sort of violence taking place. Also remember that, I don't remember how the saying goes, but it's like 80% of what you see is what you hear. Even if you didn't see anything. If the character brought his sword down and you heard a whoosh and some sort of a clang or a chopping noise, and then you heard something cry out like ah, you would know that something just got killed. So it might not even have to be something you have to handle with 3D animation. It could be just completely a sound effect, but so that you knew something was being killed. But again, you'd want to keep the noises kind of cute too, because the whole idea is that he's killing these virtually harmless things just to get these experience points. We got other questions, and some of these are things we've more or less already addressed, but it's not a bad idea, even if you already kind of know, or maybe you really know how something's going to work, to elaborate on it and really, take the time to say, well, I know that when, in this case, I know that when we kill a little character that the knight is hacking up, that we want our experience points to float up into the air, but take a moment and discuss that, or jot some notes down about it. So we see this experience number rise from our vanquished creatures, and then we can use that to show the knight getting more and more agitated, even though the numbers are increasing. So maybe he kills this butterfly and gets 3 experience points, or 15, or you have to set some sort of a scale. But then he kills the next thing, and he gets maybe 20. He's all the way up to 20, but we can tell that this is just not enough. And the reason we know that is because our knight is going to get visually more frustrated. And just so that the audience knows what he's frustrated at, so that there's no confusion, I want the knight to actually watch those numbers float up into the air. I want him to acknowledge the existence of those numbers, like those are real. That's not something that is just popping up on the screen when a player is playing a game. Inside the actual realm of the game, there really is some sort of an experience number that floats up out of a dead body for some strange reason. So our knight's going to get frustrated with that. Now, other questions, just moving on down the list. Why wouldn't the knight just kill the goblin out of hand? Why wouldn't he just run up, plant his sword right down the middle of him, and be done with it? And, well, one, that completely destroys our motive. So how does the goblin stop him? So I'm thinking, you gotta consider this sort of thing. You gotta wonder, how does a cute little goblin stop a charging knight? And what's going to happen in this case is that our goblin is going to do something that's entirely out of the ordinary in terms of the animation, in terms of our experience with the knight character, and that is that he's going to actually tell the knight to stop. Everything else that the knight has been killing are these sentient creatures, sure, but they don't speak. They just kind of stand there and get killed. This goblin is going to take some force of action and say, "Hey, stop! Quit!" And that's how the knight's going to get completely distracted by that. He's not used to his prey talking to him and actually begging him to stop, so that's going to get his attention. These are the kind of things you need to ask about and really kind of start to dwell upon and start to elaborate upon. Now, just moving down some of the things that I was working on in my story, what is it the two characters discuss? Well, we've already kind of covered this, but again, there's no harm in elaborating on it, because in the taking of these notes, in the elaboration process, you'll probably come up with some cool ideas. So jot everything down you can. Wear your writing hand out. Just write down everything you can think of. But I was thinking that it'd be funny if the goblins started questioning the morality behind arbitrary murder for the sole purpose of developing experience. And because that is kind of funny if you think about it, that people will run around inside these games doing nothing but building up their experience points just for the sake of building up their experience points, even so far as killing things that would otherwise mean them little to no harm. So he could be asking such questions, what did that butterfly ever do to you? And I don't know if I'm going to keep up, actually use that in the animation at this point, but it's just, thoughts that keep you in mind. You can present those to your friends and see what they think. We want the knight to start to ponder this. Basically, we've questioned the reason that the knight even exists. We've put a question to the core of his very being, and that's going to give our knight pause. And that's where the whole story starts to kind of turn. And he has his discovery of this fundamental flaw in his logic that's going to inevitably get him killed. So how does the knight get killed anyway? And this is a problem. This is not something that we considered. This is a major thing that we've got to figure out, and it's going to be the key to our punchline, something that up to this point in our production we hadn't really considered. And when I first came up with the idea for the story, I hadn't thought of it either. I really didn't know. As a matter of fact, when I first presented the idea to Jason, I still didn't know what was going to end up killing off our knight. And so I just told him exactly what I already told you. Knight meets goblin, it's going to kill him. They have a discussion about, the fact that he's, just killing things to gain experience. And then the knight does something stupid and got killed. And because I didn't have a solid ending, I couldn't convince Buzz that it was a good idea at first. So I had to, go back and really think about what was going to happen. And I think there were other ideas in this, but what we came up with is really probably the best one of the bunch. But it took some coming up, it took some thought. And there's some things you don't want to do, like, even if you can't think of what you want to do, start off by jotting down the stuff you don't want to do. And you'll find that in a lot of cases, your idea will spawn from that. For example, I knew that a trapdoor or a 20-ton weight gag was far too cliche. That's way too Looney Tunes, and I didn't want to do that. You could have some sort of a cute animal or some creature that the goblin knows come along, and the creature would spontaneously change into a horrible beast and eat the knight. And that was cute, but I thought that after the discussion that our two characters had, that was just a little bit too predictable. And finally, after a lot of talking and jotting down with different ideas, I came across a tree. Excuse me. And this actually, again, drew from inspiration. This was not an original idea. I got the idea because I was thinking about The Wizard of Oz. The original 1930 movie, Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy and the Scarecrow are getting apples from the trees, and the trees turn out to be alive, and one of them accosts Dorothy and even tries to grab her. And they've got these faces, they're kind of anthropomorphized. And I was thinking, what if you had a tree that was kind of like that? And so the knight is going to go attack the tree for whatever reason, and so the tree ends up killing him. So I had to once I liked that idea, I had to retrofit a story to fit into that. And there wasn't really a problem with that. Don't be afraid of that sort of thing. Just because you know how a story ends doesn't necessarily mean you know the progression of getting to the ending, and that can be the fun bit, actually the journey. So I was thinking, during the discussion, our goblin can finally have his alternative to get the knight not to kill him. All he's got to do is convince this knight that if he can go chop down that tree over there, that he'll have all the experience he ever needs and doesn't have to kill this poor goblin. And the knight's a little bit curious. That doesn't sound right, but what's the harm in chopping down a tree? Worst case scenario is I chop the tree down, and when I'm done chopping down the tree, I still haven't got any experience, so then I'll just go kill the goblin anyway. So he's going to swagger up to it, and he'll draw back his sword, and I wanted it to look like the tree was just a normal tree. Again, we come to pulling the rug out from under the audience's legs. And there's a lot of different ways you could do that. You could have an animated texture where it looks like a normal tree, or maybe a morph target where we morph into something. I thought we'd simplify it a little bit so that the tree had like this big, thick, twisted trunk. Just because I've always kind of liked the look of those big, dark, twisted trees. But so it's kind of twisted around, but the twisting is going to serve two purposes. It actually means that the tree is turned away from us. Its face is not looking at us because it's twisted like that. And so right as our knight gets up to it, he's going to draw back to take his chop, and then the tree will spin around, rear back. And this took a lot of discussion, like how is the tree going to move? And I looked at how snakes strike, for example, because I want it to be fast. I don't want to dwell on violence. I don't want people to see the knight get chomped apart bit by bit, or I don't want to bite him in half and pull a Darth Maul and watch his legs fall over or anything like that. I wanted the whole knight to just disappear in one motion that was so swift that you almost don't even really see it. But more on that later. So we came up with this idea just by sitting down and thinking about it and dwelling on it. But how do we get the knight to finally be convinced? Well, that's how we came up with the legendary tree of experience ploy, just by talking about what could this goblin say to this knight to finally convince him to walk over there and swing his sword at a tree instead of a creature that will give him experience. Well, you tell the knight that is the legendary tree of experience, and if you have what it takes to chop it down, then you'll get all of the experience you ever needed. And the funny thing is, the goblin very well could have been right, but the tree of experience, incidentally, it's a lot harder to chop down than you think because it likes to eat people that want to chop it down. So all sorts of fun you could have with that, and it all comes through asking these questions. So let's see, where do we go from there? I have other questions too. Why does the knight need his experience points in the first place? You would think it would be fairly obvious at this point in the story why the knight's doing what he's doing. We've given the audience so many visual cues. We kill something, we see the EXP numbers start to float up into the air. The knight has acknowledged this on many occasions, but why does he need the experience? Because it'd be nice if the goblin could actually ask him that. What are you doing this for? What's the point? And so we had to come up with almost a sub-story, like a plot line that the knight character was following, just to have a reason for coming out here and doing this. And after a lot of drafting and coming up with different ideas, we finally settled on that the knight needed some sort of a quest. He's a knight. He needs a quest. They all do. And in this case, we thought up that he could be searching for some ancient relic. And then I came back to his sword. And this was just something that, again, we go back to nothing new under the sun. I was drawing on some inspiration. What about, the sword and the stone? We have, the legendary Excalibur that so many knights wanted to hold because it was the sword that King Arthur used. So what if he's looking for some legendary sword to replace his fairly common sword that he's already been swinging around? And so we came up with this plotline of the Sword of Illusions, which we don't even really know what it does. It's just some big cool sword the knight really wants to get. But you could build that up, and that could become part of the discussion. And I liked that idea a lot, because in the end, you could animate really well to it. You'd have the knight getting really excited. He's like, of course this is why I'm doing this. It's the Sword of Illusions. It's got all this great things it can do. It was made by a group of gods to vanquish some sort of demon dragon, whatever. But whatever the key there is, it doesn't matter. It's just that you want there to be something that the knight is actually doing, or he needs to accomplish, and that's why he's killing all these other creatures to build up these experience points. And even from that came with, why do you need experience just to go walk over and pick up a sword? Well, in gaming terms, you could say that you can't even touch the sword until your experience points are X amount of whatever. But that's actually in that discussion, in thinking about that, that's how we came up with the idea of another character that we just talk about, some ancient bad guy that the knight has to fight in order to claim the sword. And that's how we came up with Ragnaroth, which is just going back to more inspiration. That's a combination of Astaroth, which I think the first time I ever heard that was in the film Bedknobs and Broomsticks. and then Ragnarok, which I think is like the Viking Armageddon or something like that. I don't remember my history, but I combined the two and came up with Ragnarok, and it just sounded cool. So that is a quick look. Quick, I guess, haha. That is a look at all of the different things that I employed to help come up with a story, as well as some things that maybe I didn't necessarily employ, but you could. And you could use this as a structure and as a basis to develop your own ideas, because now you have a clearer picture of how I came up with my idea. The story that I'm using is not something that I just thought up on a whim. It's not that I sat down in front of my computer and just started typing and it just came to me. Though you will find that a lot of the ideas that you come up with will feel like they just came to you. And part of the key of getting them to do that, part of the key of coaxing those ideas out into the open, is putting yourself in a situation where the ideas can spawn in the first place. Get that inspiration. Start looking at things that have to do with the kind of story you want to tell. Take a look at what you like and what you don't like. If you're trying to be funny, take a look at what you think is funny and what you don't, and try to pick apart why it is or why it isn't, and what you want to incorporate and what you don't. Don't think you had to invent the wheel. In fact, in most cases, if you try to invent the wheel, you're going to end up being unsuccessful, and people won't like your film as much, because there is originality to be had in inspiration. I mean, even Jack Skellington, I like to think that The Nightmare Before Christmas is one of the most original flicks I've ever seen, but I look at Jack Skellington, and it seems like, I keep thinking to myself, that's probably Edgar Allan Poe. It's like he died, and that's what he ended up doing after he died from tuberculosis, is he became Jack Skellington, this creative and kind of dark and brooding genius who, but maybe Poe is a little bit too dark. That's just how, it reminded me of that. There's inspiration to be had everywhere. Don't be afraid to draw on inspiration. But I guess that's really all I have to say. I wanted this to be less of a hardcore lecture and more of just kind of a general sit-down discussion over how to develop a story idea. So hopefully you found some sort of a help in this. Hopefully this allows you to have some sort of assistance in coming up with your ideas. And that is going to wrap things up for this lecture. Thanks a lot.